1,000 songs. And it goes right in my pocket.
Failure of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative.
Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about innovation in the enterprise, brought to you and run by Collective Campus, an innovation hub based in Australia that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies and tools to successfully explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. For more information, go to www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared, everybody. We've got a special guest for you on today's program, Whitney Johnson. She was recognized as one of the world's most influential management thinkers in 2015 and was a finalist for the Top Thinkers on Talent at the biennial Thinkers 50 ceremony in London. She is best known for her work on driving corporate innovation through personal disruption. She's formerly the co-founder of Rose Park Advisors alongside Clayton Christensen, author of The Innovator's Dilemma. Together, they invested in and led the $8 million seed round for Korea's Coupang, currently valued at over $5 billion. Johnson is also a frequent contributor to and writer for the Harvard Business Review, and is a linked influencer. She's the author of the critically acclaimed Disrupt Yourself and Dare, Dream, Do. She's received widespread recognition for her thinking and was named one of Fortune 55's most influential women on Twitter in 2014. She co-founded the popular 40 Women Over 40 to Watch and is a fellow at the Tribeca Disruptive Innovation Awards. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to introduce Whitney Johnson. Welcome to the show, Whitney.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Firstly, I guess congratulations are in order. It's Disrupt Yourself. Your book has been, a bestseller in the business and motivation category, and has received critical acclaim from the likes of Steve Wozniak, Clayton Christensen, Eric Ries, Tom Peters, and Susan Cain.
Thank you. I've been thrilled by the response.
And so you should be. And I guess I reached out because this concept of disrupting yourself is one that I can personally relate to. I mean, we might get into that a little bit later, but more importantly, I guess in this era of rapid disruption where, in Australia, 60% of jobs are subject to being replaced in the next 10 to 15 years, and there's a lot of talk out there about, robots and automation replacing 50% of today's jobs worldwide in the next 15 to 20 years. Standing still is simply not an option, it seems.
That's right. That's right. And my premise here is that as I looked at disruption and really analyzed it, I first discovered it when I was still an equity analyst working on Wall Street. And then I ended up working with Clayton Christensen and founding a fund that invested in disruptive stocks as well as early stage companies. And the more I delved into these ideas, it occurred to me that disruption isn't just about products and services and companies and even countries, but that the fundamental unit of disruption is the individual, and that if we can learn to ride the waves of learning and mastering, we can have a competitive advantage in an era of accelerating disruption. So it's not just about coping, but in fact harnessing its power and unpredictability to propel us forward.
So to that end, perhaps you can give us a quick overview of how you've managed to disrupt yourself over the years.
I've disrupted myself many times. So just in terms of the term of art, a disruption is a low-end or new market innovation that eventually upends an industry. So like Toyota did to GM, like Target did to Sears, like Amazon did to Barnes & Noble and Borders, and now we've got Airbnb doing to the hotel industry. And so personal disruption is when an individual starts at the low end or in a new market and then eventually upends their career.
Sure.
And so for me, disruption has started, I first started with disruption when I walked onto Wall Street through the secretarial side door. That was a low end disruption because I couldn't have walked in the front door. I'd been a music major in college. They would never have hired me. But as I started as a secretary, then I got my foothold and I was eventually able to move up to an investment banker and then an equity research analyst. So that was one personal disruption. Another one was when I had just moved into equity research to cover the cement and construction sector, and Smith Barney announced it would merge with Salomon Brothers, and they already had a highly ranked research analyst, cement and construction. And so according to the theory of disruption, rather than knocking on the cement door that was closed, I just built my own door, so a new market, and eventually I became a ranked analyst as well. So that's a new market disruption. And the third I'll mention is that when I was working on Wall Street. Now I was an institutional investor ranked analyst. I've been there for 8 years, and I was absolutely at the top of my game. I'd just gone down to Mexico. I'd worked with Carlos Slim, who's one of the richest people in the world. He trades places with Bill Gates.
Mm-hmm.
He was quoting my research, referring to me as La Whitney, and I decided that I was going to quit my job. And my friends and probably some of my family thought I was absolutely out of my mind. And so that's an example of when you're at the top of your game. That's a classic or quintessential example of disrupting yourself, to jump to a new curve and try something new.
Definitely. And I can totally relate to family thinking you're crazy. I spent, I totally relate. I spent 6 years, in university getting master's degrees in your traditional sort of accounting, commerce fields, and I spent time at working at big consulting firms and then at an investment bank. And then I just quit just to pursue this crazy startup idea, which was essentially just an Airbnb for office space kind of idea. And since then, I've just gone on a complete tangent, and it's been so rewarding. And I guess to that end, I've heard you quote that, companies that successfully manage to commercialize disruptive innovation, or I suppose are first to move in that space, are 6 times more likely to succeed, and the revenue generation potential is about 20 times greater. And I mean, to me, it seems as if that also applies to the individual. For example, if it's a new emerging industry and you're the first to see opportunities in that space, for example, going back 10 years, if you're one of the first to start really getting your social media chops up and getting your thought leadership up to a very visible level in that space, you would find it difficult for anyone to come in and topple you now.
That's exactly right. The principles apply. I mean, that's what's so compelling here is that we think about the idea of market versus competitive risk, and it applies for a product and a company, but it also applies for an individual, as you just said, a person who got involved in social media, or let's call it Twitter, 10 years ago, now has probably hundreds of thousands of followers. Compared to a person who starts today, it will be much, much more difficult for that person to get 100,000 followers. And so as a first mover, you have a clear advantage.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Innovator's Dilemma and some of the concepts put forward by your business partner, Clayton Christensen, in that space. And I guess, some of these concepts such as, net present value, internal rate of return, some of these short-term metrics that often inhibit innovation in large companies, I guess I can draw parallels between them and some of our own sort of short-term targets as human beings. We don't want to quit our job because maybe we have mortgage repayments to cover and we've got a trip to save up for, and it seems like it's never the right time. But the fact is, it never is the right time, and sometimes you just need to take that leap.
It's a great observation that we've got our own sort of internal NPV. And what's fascinating to me is that oftentimes people will, when they think about disrupting themselves, they'll say, well, I don't have the money. And yet I remember talking to one fellow, actually he responded to a blog post of mine on HBR, on Harvard Business Review, and he said, I have 10 years of savings in the bank and I still won't disrupt myself. And so I think it's really important for us. Sometimes money is absolutely the consideration, but I think oftentimes it isn't. And so it's important for us to figure out, ask the 5 whys. Why won't I? Why won't I? Why won't I? And if you can finally get to the root cause of why you're not disrupting yourself, then you can start to address it. What I will say is that pretty much 90% of people struggle to disrupt because they're afraid. And so if you can figure out ways to mitigate that fear, then you're more likely to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think people are more inclined to do what the masses do. And if you're doing what everybody else is doing, then chances are you're not really going to differentiate yourself. The lower risk, the lower the reward. And I guess that doesn't really lend itself to personal fulfillment. I know there's a stat out there that 70% seems to be a common stat. 70% of projects tend to fail. 70% of government IT projects fail. And it seems as if I know in terms of employee engagement, 70% of employees in the United States I know are actively disengaged from their work. Like they just don't enjoy what they do. They tend to live for the weekend. And it seems as if people are just afraid to chase their dreams.
I think that's right. And it's true. And so the question is, can we allow people to bring their dreams to work? Are we willing to? And that's one of the premises for me is that if you if you can allow your people to bring their dreams to work by allowing them to disrupt themselves internally rather than having to go somewhere else to try something new, your retention goes way up, your high potentials stay, and so your cost of doing business actually goes down when you allow people to bring their dreams to work as opposed to going up. It may take more time in the near term because you've got to talk to them and figure out what they want to do and maybe allow them to move and lose short-term productivity, but over the long term, it really will make a difference in terms of both your revenue generation as well as your bottom line and profitability.
Yeah, and that's right. And I know I recently had David Burkus, author of Under New Management, on the podcast, and he talked about this concept of employee centric management, where you put the employee first and the customer second. And if your employees are happy and actively engaged and they find their jobs rewarding, they're more likely to take a sense of ownership in that particular company and pass on that sense of, I suppose, loyalty and obligation to the customer. And so the customer is going to receive a much better experience, and that employee is also going to be in tune with some of the opportunities for growth within that company. They're going to be coming up with ideas. They're going to be more actively engaged. I think it's absolutely critical that we help people, like you said, tap into their inherent sort of desires or whatever motivates them.
Happy employee, happy customer.
Yeah, exactly. And earlier in this chat, you touched on the concept of entering through the side door when you became a secretary on Wall Street. I think people who perhaps occupy a certain role in society or are making a certain amount of money don't want to take perhaps what may be perceived by their friends, family, society as a step back. But how important is it sometimes to take that one step back to going through the side door rather than to just try, stealth your way through the front door?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we have the luxury of walking in the front door, and so. But what I would say is that when you are walking in the front door, that doesn't involve disruption. I mean, you're familiar with the frameworks of Clayton. There's disruption and then there's sustaining innovation. I think when you can walk in the front door, then that's a sustaining innovation, which is perfectly fine. My point, though, is that sometimes if you're looking for your work in particular to do the job of not only the functional job of putting food on the table, but also the emotional job of it giving you fulfillment, sometimes the way to get there is to not continue to climb the ladder, but to move to a new ladder. And so that's sometimes you've got to take a step back. And if you think about it, the step back can be just taking a step back to evaluate where you are, but also think about sports. I mean, if you're on a diving board and you're getting ready to dive into a pool, you crouch down before you spring off the board. And so very frequently when it comes to sports, you've got to step back before you can move forward. And I think the same is also true with our career in our business. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And any disruptive innovation, generally takes, I wouldn't say for all disruptive innovations, but, there's quite a few case studies out there that show it may take 2, 3, 4, 5 years for it to actually become, I suppose, to have an impact in the markets.
Absolutely. And that goes back to the idea of the S curve, right? I mean, as an equity analyst, I looked at America Mobile, so emerging markets telecom, and what we found is that wireless was introduced in Mexico in 1988. I mean, penetration was less than 1% for almost a decade.
That's right.
But once it was ready to move up that S curve from 1997 to 2002, it went from 1% to 25%. But to your point, you can be at the low end of the curve for a very long time.
That's right. And it's interesting. I mean, we touched on earlier being the first to gain, a foothold on a new beachhead, for example, entering the social media space 10 years ago. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking out loud around the whole sort of lean startup philosophy, build, measure, learn. Can you perhaps apply that concept of, hey, let's try and disrupt ourselves in small sort of iterations? Can we do stuff in a certain area for maybe a few months and see if we can gain some sort of feedback that's going to motivate us to take further steps in that sort of space, rather than just, quit our jobs and then commit the next 3 to 4 years of our lives to something may or may not pay off?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, I'm a big big proponent and advocate of Steve Blank and obviously of Eric Ries. And I do think that when you're at the low end of the curve, one of the things you're trying to figure out is, okay, so the odds are 6 times higher that you're going to be successful when you disrupt. But that percentage goes from 6% to 36%. So there's still a 64% probability that it won't work. And so the thing you want to do at the very low end of the curve is to iterate and have really tight constraints. So that's the measuring. That's the learning, because those constraints give you information. The tighter the scope that you can have, the more information you can get, so you can find out more quickly if in fact your idea can gain momentum, or you're on the wrong curve and you just jump to a new curve more quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think this podcast is perhaps a great testament to that. You know, it was literally launched a couple of months ago, and as we were chatting before we went live, we hit number 1 in the business news category here in Asia Pac a couple of weeks ago, and literally it was a test. And now we're interviewing the likes of yourself. I've got Ted Rubin on the podcast later today, Steve Blank tomorrow, and I think in today's day and age where it's never been cheaper to start a business. It's never been cheaper to test assumptions online. There are really no excuses not to try. Going back 10 years, perhaps you needed to take out a $100,000 loan, a $200,000 loan. I know Peter Diamandis always talks about the fact that in 2001, it cost $5 million to start a business. In 2011, it was $5,000, and today it's even less. So there are, I think, in my opinion, it doesn't seem to be that there are excuses today. I mean, you can work full time and still try something on the side.
Right, and I think that's exactly right, and it's actually quite a fun exercise to say to yourself, okay, if I only had $1,000 in 3 months, like what could I get done with those resources? The whole notion of bootstrapping, and it's intriguing to me that. There was a study done in the U.S. In 2007. They compiled this list of the 500 fastest growing companies in the United States. And what they found is that only 4% of these companies had access to venture capital. Only 28% had access to debt. And so at least 50%, as much as 72% of these businesses had bootstrapped, and 61% were profitable in the first year. And so the question is like, were they successful in spite of or because of their constraints? And I think when we're willing to say, okay, I'm going to impose these constraints, we're likely to get the business model right a lot faster.
Correct. And, for a startup, getting funded can often be a blessing and a curse, depending on what stage that startup is in its life cycle. I think you've correctly alluded to the fact that if a startup gets too much funding early, they're more likely to believe that their business model is validated. And as is often the case, they just waste all their money building out their business, throwing it on marketing, and eventually shutting their gates.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of finding what you should be exploring, you've touched on this concept in previous blog posts of disruptive strengths. Can you perhaps talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this idea of disruptive or distinctive strengths, it's something that you do well that other people within your sphere do not. And a great example of this is Horace Dediu, who you may be familiar with him. He's a Simco. And he loved smartphones. He grew up as a U.S. Romanian citizen. He thought that phones were going to disrupt PCs. This is like 15 years ago. So he graduates from college and gets his job at Nokia. Well, it turns out that computing was taking all the money out of telecom, so after a decade at Nokia, he left and applied all of his knowledge of the disrupted to think differently about the disruptor, Apple. And today, as you know, he's one of the foremost analysts on Apple out there with these spot-on financial predictions. So he was very much a telecom fish swimming in Apple waters. So that's the distinctive strength. And I think the trouble for most people is figuring out what their strengths are in the first place. And so what I like to do is have people think about, okay, what is my strength? For example, what compliments do you get over and over and over and over again, so much that you dismiss them because for you it's as natural as breathing. And so how do you figure out a way to use that strength very deliberately and not just when you're in a bind, and then take that strength and put yourself in a situation or a context where no one else has that strength?
Yeah, definitely. And it's quite funny. I mean, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the innovator's DNA and how there's this concept of associational thinking, connecting the dots between lots of different things. I guess you need to be putting yourself out there and experiencing lots of different things and seeing where you will get this positive, feedback loop from people. I think there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more you can expose yourself to a variety of people and ideas, the more likely you are to come with a fresh notion.
Yeah, and I guess combined with a sense of self-awareness to say, hey, people seem to really like my blogs. Maybe I should explore something further in this space. Or, people seem to think that I'm a great connector of people. Is there something I could be doing in this space?
Right. Now, here's the irony, though. Because this is natural as breathing for us, we tend to undervalue it. And so people do not actually use their strengths. They try to use the things that they worked really hard to learn how to do, but those oftentimes are not their greatest strengths because they work really hard at them. And so what I find is if people really want to be successful in disrupting, they will make sure that they figure out what their greatest strengths are, which they tend to undervalue, and use those deliberately.
Yeah, definitely. And that is a great segue into what I wanted to talk about next. As children, I think today's school system still molds children to become, accountants, lawyers, doctors, and so on. And oftentimes, I guess children are pushed into a certain direction without too much sort of, awareness or we don't really pay attention to their inherent sort of strengths. And I guess with 60% of jobs set to be replaced, robots, automation, there's statistics out there that suggest children today will have upwards of 7 careers and 15 jobs in their lifetime. How important is it that, we teach children, or at least expose them somewhat to this concept of finding your strengths from a young age, of being open to disrupting yourself and not being, going through the typical rigmarole? I'm going to go to school, I'm going to go to uni, I'm going to get a bachelor's degree, and then I'm going to spend, 20 or 30 years being an accountant.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think that kids view the world that way at this point. I really don't. I think, any kid that's growing up now has probably seen, or certainly a millennial has seen their someone in their family get laid off or be decimated by the economy at some level. And they've seen, people lose work. Sorry, I just said that. That's redundant. But anyway, they've seen people lose work. And so I think, the statistics I've heard is that millennials will hold 14 jobs by the time they're 40. So any child growing up now, I think instinctively understands disruption because they live in a disruptive world. And so when I look at my children, so I have children 14 or 15 and 19, they don't, the concept of having one job or being a company man or woman for their entire life, it doesn't even compute for them.
Yeah, and I guess that is true of, we're seeing that with Gen Y. The turnover of staff is getting higher and higher. And I know from my own personal experience, I've not spent more than 3 years at any one company. However, when I look at previous generations, it was obviously quite normal for you to spend. The beauty of that is now that when people do only spend a year, maybe 2, no one sees that as a blight on the resume anymore. Whereas it used to be something that was a problem. Now we're like, yeah, of course they've changed. Of course, that's what you do. Yeah, definitely. And I think some of the more progressive organizations who are looking to hire lateral thinkers, creative types, people who will help them innovate, they tend to steer clear of people who have, spent, say, the last 10 years in the same organization, because I guess it suggests a lack of perhaps curiosity on that person's part.
Right, I think that's right, which is, wow, right? It's so different than it was 20 and 30 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Whitney, I think I wanted to wrap up with 3 questions, 2 hypotheticals and 1 basically on lifestyle design. So I obviously haven't shared these with you previously, so you're on the spot.
Okay, associational thinking, right?
Yep, here we go. So number 1, if you could work for any company at any stage of their life cycle, who would it be and why?
Wow. Any company at any stage of their life cycle, who would it be? And wow. Yeah. Okay, you know what? I'll just say what came into my mind first. Google.
Google. At what stage and why?
I would say right when it was going into the sweet spot. So right as it was moving into hypergrowth, that would have been really fun. Really fun.
Yeah, maybe not the first few years when it was kind of like a lot of, ramen noodles and whatnot.
Yeah, And I think, given my skill set, I don't know that I would have had necessarily something to offer at that early stage, but being able to help scale and grow, I think would have been really fun.
Yeah, definitely. I actually had this conversation last night. I said, I'm interviewing Whitney Johnson tomorrow morning. I'm going to ask her this question. And the person I was with, I asked them that question, and they actually said Google as well. And, after...
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, it is. I was going to say Apple when Steve Jobs came back, which is probably very typical, but hey, I'm standing by it.
Yeah.
So number two, if you could ask anybody, dead or alive, a question, who would it be and what would you ask?
I would ask, Catherine Graham. She ran the Washington Post for a really long time.
Yep.
And I think I would ask her what it was like when she first took the reins of the company. I mean, she wrote this amazing biography of herself, or autobiography, but I think it'd be really, I would love to sit down and talk with her and just hear about her experience.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And just to let you know, you're the first guest I'm asking these questions, so this will be an ongoing piece. So you're kind of like the guinea pig today, Whitney. My apologies.
Oh, no, I think it's fun. It makes it more interesting.
Definitely.
To ask off questions.
And the final one was on lifestyle design. So I like to get inside the heads of high-performing people and find out how they stay on top of their games. So what does your typical day look like? How do you stay so productive?
Okay, well, I've recently shifted, but I've made a goal to get up at 6 o'clock every day, like 5:45, and I'm trying to work toward getting up at 5. And then right when I get up, I like to do something that is more contemplative, like whether it's, reading the Bible or just reading, doing something meditative that gets myself centered and grounded. Maybe do a few minutes of yoga with my daughter. And then for the first 2 hours of the day, focus on the projects that actually really require thinking and feel somewhat intimidating to me, because if I can get those sort of important but not urgent activities done in the first couple of hours of the day, then the rest of the day seems to go pretty well. Yeah, no, and that makes perfect sense, and I think it resonates with a lot of people who have quite demanding lives. So thank you so much, Whitney. That was great. Where can our audience go to find out a little bit more about you and get a copy of your book, Disrupt Yourself? Oh, thank you for asking. Well, Disrupt Yourself is in any major retailer. So if you just go on Amazon, you can find it there, or it's available. So that's the first question. My website's whitneyjohnson.com, and if you're interested in my newsletter, you can certainly email me at whitney@whitneyjohnson.com and say sign me up, and I'll sign you up for that. And then you can obviously follow me on Twitter at Johnson Whitney or on LinkedIn. Perfect. Thank you so much. We will share those details in our show notes on SoundCloud. So thanks again for being with us today. You've been a wonderful guest, and I'm sure the concept of disrupting yourself is one that our audience will ponder. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's it for our chat with Whitney Johnson. I hope you enjoyed that. I think this concept of disrupting yourself is more powerful now than it's ever been. The barriers to entry have never been lower. The playing field has never been more even. Are you disrupting yourself? Should you be? Are your passions and your strengths being utilized effectively in your current role? Is your job or your industry under threat? Some questions to ponder, perhaps. If you're enjoying our podcast, I would love it if you take 30 seconds out of your day to subscribe and like us on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And if you want to sign up to our mailing list, you can do so at futuresquared.xyz. Otherwise, that's it for now. I look forward to bringing you more insightful guests in the very, very near future. Future Squared out.